It began with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The kind that comes when life has already settled into quiet routines, coffee before dawn, the same 4 booths at the diner, the same tired faces passing through on their lunch breaks. The air that morning carried the smell of wet asphalt and old coffee. I was slicing lemons behind the counter when the manager, Gary, waved me over, holding the cordless phone like it might bite. "Claire," he said, "some lawyer wants you." His voice had that edge of curiosity small towns never outgrow. I wiped my hands on my apron and took the call, expecting another debt collector or maybe a wrong number. Instead, a man's voice, smooth and practiced, said, "Miss Whitaker, this is Daniel Kerrigan from Adler and Price Law. I'm calling regarding the estate of Michael Adler." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The name hit me like static in the ear. "I think you have the wrong Claire," I said, already feeling the tremor in my throat. "No," he said quietly. "Mr. Adler named you as his sole heir. We're reading the will this afternoon." I just stood there, lemons bleeding juice across the cutting board, thinking how strange it was to hear his name again after nearly 10 years of silence. Michael had been gone so long that he'd become more memory than man. A chapter I'd convinced myself was closed for good. We'd been married for 6 years and divorced for almost 9. No kids, no property, no real reason to stay in touch. He'd left the way people do when they've already disappeared inside themselves. One morning he was gone, his side of the closet empty, the key on the table beside a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." The kind of sorry that doesn't ask for forgiveness, only distance. Now a stranger's voice was telling me he was dead. My ex-husband, the man who walked out without a goodbye, had left me everything he owned, and I couldn't even remember the sound of his laugh. The lawyer's office was downtown, in one of those sandstone buildings built back when Riverton still believed in its own future. The kind of place where the floors groan and the air smells faintly of ink and polish. Outside, rain kept falling in thin, steady lines, soft enough to be ignored, steady enough to matter. I sat in the waiting room watching droplets chase each other down the window. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Maybe grief does that. Or maybe it was just the lighting too honest for comfort. When Daniel Kerrigan called me in, his voice matched the phone low, practiced, careful not to bruise. "Thank you for coming, Miss Whitaker," he said, offering me a seat at a small conference table. "I know this must be difficult." On the table sat a single manila folder, thick with paper. He opened it as if handling something sacred. "Mr. Adler's estate is modest, but the instructions are very clear. Everything goes to you." I laughed under my breath, the sound dry as dust. "Everything?" Michael never believed in owning more than what fit in his car. Kerrigan gave me a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Sometimes people are different in death than they were in life." He slid an envelope toward me. My name was written in Michael's handwriting, the same precise, slightly tilted script he used for grocery lists and birthday cards. Seeing it again felt like opening a wound that had healed in the wrong shape. The paper was heavy, the kind that holds its silence. "He asked that you read this privately," Kerrigan said. I nodded, but my hands were trembling. I left the office before he could say anything else. Outside, the air smelled of rain and exhaust. I sat in my car for a long time, the envelope resting on my knees, afraid of what waited inside. Then I opened it. "Claire, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I've made choices I can't defend, but maybe I can explain them. There's a key taped inside this letter to a storage unit, room 414. Everything you find there will tell you the truth about why I left. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I hope you'll understand. I never stopped thinking about you. I just couldn't stay and watch what I'd done ruin you too. Michael." There was a small brass key taped under the fold, cool and quiet against my fingers. The kind of key you could lose in a pocket and never know what door it opened until years later. I sat there until the rain slowed, watching people pass, umbrellas tilted like small defenses against the world. Then I drove to the address printed on the back of the letter. The storage facility sat near the old rail yard, where the tracks ended in weeds and forgotten machinery. The office clerk handed me a clipboard and gave a polite nod. 414's down the second hall, he said. The concrete echoed under my shoes, each step sounding louder than it should have. When I turned the key, the metal door rolled open with a reluctant groan, the kind of sound you only hear from things that haven't been touched in years. Inside were 7 cardboard boxes, stacked neatly against the wall, a garment bag hanging from a hook, and a black guitar case resting on the floor. No furniture, no dust-covered mementos. Just a life arranged for discovery. I opened the nearest box. Inside were files company memos, invoices, handwritten notes, all stamped with names I didn't recognize. Adler Manufacturing, Lakeview Medical Supply, Wilson Pharmaceuticals. I turned over a page and saw something underlined twice in red. Lot 2387, do not ship. Beneath it, a receipt showing the same lot marked as delivered. In another box, I found a small notebook filled with Michael's handwriting numbers, names, sketches of supply routes, then a folder labeled Evidence, Keep Safe. The words made my pulse tighten. The final box held a single flash drive in a plastic sleeve. On it, in his handwriting again, if something happens to me. I closed the box, my breath catching in my chest. Whatever Michael had left me, it wasn't money. It was something else, something heavier. When I drove home, the town looked different, as if it knew something I didn't. The diner lights glowed faintly through the fog. The old steel mill stood silent against the river, its rusted bones half swallowed by mist. I kept thinking about that phrase, if something happens to me. It sounded less like a warning and more like a promise he knew he couldn't keep. At home, I placed the letter and the flash drive on my kitchen table and sat in the dark for a long time. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and the cat I never officially adopted brushed against my leg like it sensed the storm coming. I poured a glass of wine, though it tasted like metal. For years, I'd told myself I'd moved on, that some stories end without explanations. But sitting there with Michael's letter in my hand, I realized how easily the past can find its way back. Not with love. Not even with regret, just with unfinished business. I looked at the flash drive again, its red light blinking faintly in the dim room, like a heartbeat trying to come back to life. That's when I understood. Whatever Michael had been hiding, whatever truth had cost him everything, it wasn't over. It had just found its way home to me. The morning after I found the letter, the air felt unnaturally still, as if the world was waiting for me to make a mistake. I woke before sunrise, the window still beaded with last night's rain, and for a long time I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. I had work at 7, but my body moved like it belonged to someone else, someone pretending life could still be normal. The diner looked the same as always, steam fogging the front glass, the radio humming a country song older than most of the customers, the smell of bacon clinging to the air vents. Everything ordinary, everything safe. Yet inside, I felt a kind of tremor, the quiet before a bridge gives way. Gary, my manager, watched me pour coffee like a man trying to decide if he should say something. "You okay, Claire?" he asked finally. "You look like you saw a ghost." I almost told him the truth, that I had, but instead, I smiled and said I was fine. Fine, that small word that people like me use when we are too tired to explain how not fine we really are. After my shift, I sat in the car for nearly an hour, staring at the flash drive lying on the passenger seat. It was small, ordinary, silver, the kind of thing you could lose in a drawer, but it was heavier than it should have been. I kept hearing Michael's voice in my head from the letter. Everything you find there will tell you the truth about why I left. I drove home slowly, past the old steel mill and the half-empty strip mall, until I reached my apartment where the curtains never closed right. I brewed tea that I did not drink, and turned on the old laptop that took a full minute to wake up. The screen flickered, then steadied, the cursor blinking like a small pulse. I plugged the flash drive in. 3 files appeared. One was a video file, one a folder labeled Shipments 2016 to 2020, and one text file titled, "To Claire, watch this first." I opened the text file. "Claire, if you are reading this, you have already seen the letter. There is more you need to understand before anyone else finds out. Play the video, then decide what to do. Whatever happens next, remember you did not choose this. I did. Michael." My hands trembled as I clicked on the video. The screen filled with static before it resolved into Michael's face. He was sitting at a desk in a dimly lit room, wearing a faded gray shirt, his hair shorter than I remembered. Behind him was a small digital clock showing 2:47 in the morning. His eyes looked hollowed out, but his voice was calm, almost deliberate. "Claire," he said softly, If you are watching this, I am already gone. I just need you to understand why I disappeared." He looked down, rubbed his temples, then looked back at the camera. "You remember the company, Adler Manufacturing. After I got promoted, I started managing contracts for a pharmaceutical distributor out of Cleveland. We handled generic drugs for small-town pharmacies across Ohio and Pennsylvania, cheap meds for families that could not afford anything else. But the truth is, they were not what they claimed to be." He took a breath, slow and careful. "We were shipping expired medication, sometimes months old, sometimes years. They would relabel the boxes, print new barcodes, and repackage the drugs as fresh. The company saved hundreds of thousands of dollars each quarter. The supervisors called it optimization, the accountants called it efficiency. But what it really was fraud. And nobody cared, as long as the reports looked clean." He paused, his eyes glancing off screen. "Then one day I saw a memo about pediatric injectables. Children's medicine. The batch numbers did not match the records. I went to my supervisor. He told me to stop asking questions, said I was making enemies I could not afford." He leaned closer to the camera. "I thought I could fix it quietly. I copied documents. I kept records. I even went to the company's compliance officer. A week later, my car was broken into. My apartment was trashed. And then they sent a message." He reached off screen and held up a photograph. His hand shook slightly. "It was your father's house, Claire. They took a picture of the front door. They wanted me to know how close they could get. I felt my body go cold. My father had died 2 years after the divorce, but the image of that old white porch, with the chipped blue steps, flashed in my mind so vividly I could smell the paint." Michael's voice broke the memory. "So I left. I thought if I cut you off completely you would be safe. I thought I could disappear, and they would lose interest. But guilt does not dissolve, it just waits. When one of the bad batches caused a recall, lot 2387, I knew the cover-up had killed people. Children. The company paid off families, falsified death certificates, silenced doctors. Everything handled quietly. Always quietly." He laughed then, but it was the kind of laugh people make when they have stopped believing in forgiveness. Quiet, that is the word they use. Quiet settlements. Quiet deaths. Quiet guilt. He leaned closer. "The flash drive you found has everything. Emails, transaction ledgers. Enough to prove what they did. But do not trust the system, Claire. They have friends everywhere. Regulators, politicians, maybe even the police. There is one person you can go to. Her name is Dr. Evelyn Marsh. She used to run quality control before she quit. She is the only one who ever tried to stop them." The video cut off suddenly. The sound of my apartment came rushing back, refrigerator humming, rain dripping from the gutters, a car passing outside. I just sat there staring at the dark screen, my reflection faint in the glass. I opened the folder labeled Shipments 2016 to 2020. The files were endless spreadsheets, scanned invoices, correspondence. Every document was meticulous. I started reading. Each entry listed batch numbers, manufacturing dates, distribution routes. Some batches were marked reprocessed, others destroyed. But when I cross-referenced the numbers, I saw the same lots appearing again weeks later as shipped. It was systematic, deliberate, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The deeper I went, the sicker I felt. It was not just negligence, it was architecture. A machine built to bury the truth beneath paperwork and compliance reports. Somewhere between the second and third spreadsheet, I realized my hands were trembling so badly I could barely scroll. Michael had been right. He had not left me for someone else. He had left me because he was terrified that staying would get me killed. And somehow, in dying, he had dragged me back into the same darkness he had tried to escape. I closed the laptop when the clock struck midnight. The apartment was quiet except for the rain easing against the window. I thought about Michael's face on the screen, how his eyes looked like a man who had already died long before his heart stopped. I thought about Dr. Evelyn Marsh, the name he had spoken like a lifeline. And I thought about the truth sitting in those files, cold and undeniable. I poured another cup of tea that had already gone cold and sat by the window watching the empty street. The town looked calm, but I could feel something shifting, like a current beneath still water. Somewhere out there, the people who ruined him were still living their comfortable lives, waiting for the storm they thought would never return. I touched the flash drive again, feeling the weight of it in my palm. Michael had said, "You did not choose this." I did. But standing there, I knew that whatever came next, I would have to choose. The truth had already found me, and there was no pretending I could go back to the life I had before. The following day felt like standing in the middle of a frozen lake, aware of the cracks forming beneath my feet but too afraid to move. The world went on, pretending nothing had changed: traffic lights, church bells, neighbors walking their dogs, but everything inside me had shifted. I called in sick to the diner, something I had not done in years. Gary said to rest and drink soup, but his voice had the flatness of a man who did not believe me. I sat at the kitchen table with the flash drive beside my cup of coffee, the steam curling upward like something alive, and tried to decide what to do next. Michael had said to find Dr. Evelyn Marsh. I did not know her, but her name carried the quiet authority of someone who had once mattered. I searched her online. The first result was an old article from a local newspaper dated 4 years earlier. It said she had resigned from Lakeview Pharmaceuticals after internal disagreements regarding product safety. There was a small photograph, a woman in her 50s with dark hair streaked with silver, standing outside a courthouse, her eyes sharp, unafraid. She looked like someone who had spent her whole life being right too early. The article ended by saying she had since opened a small clinic on the edge of town, specializing in community care. By noon, I was sitting in my car outside that clinic. The building was modest brick walls, peeling paint, the kind of place that existed more for necessity than profit. I hesitated before going in. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked paper. A nurse looked up from the desk. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. I said no. She asked if it was an emergency. I said, "Something like that." Dr. Marsh met me 15 minutes later. She had the same eyes as in the photograph, the same air of exhaustion worn like a medal. "You said you wanted to talk about Adler Manufacturing," she said, her voice cautious but steady. I nodded and took a breath that did not quite reach my lungs. My ex-husband worked there. His name was Michael Adler. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I remember him. He was the logistics manager, right? He disappeared around the time they started the recalls." I placed the flash drive on the table between us like evidence in a trial. "He left this for me. He's dead now. He said you were the only person who tried to stop what was happening." She stared at it without touching it. "Then he was right," she said quietly. "I was, and it cost me everything." She gestured for me to sit, then poured coffee from a thermos that looked older than I was. The smell was bitter and comforting. They were reusing expired stock, falsifying destruction reports, and pushing the shipments through smaller distributors to keep it hidden. I filed internal complaints, sent letters to the Food and Drug Administration, even met with a state investigator. Nothing happened. A week later, I found a dead cat on my porch and a note under my windshield that said, "Keep quiet for your own good." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she had told this story too many times to still believe in outrage. They had protection higher up than anyone wanted to admit. I quit before I ended up in a river. Most people just moved on. She looked at the flash drive again. But if he kept records, real ones, that's different. That could change everything. I hesitated. "He said people died." She nodded slowly. "They did. 2 children in Erie, an elderly woman in Youngstown, a veteran who couldn't afford his heart medication. I kept their names. The company paid for silence, but you cannot pay away ghosts." The words settled between us like dust. I felt something inside me begin to harden, not anger yet, but the shape of it. "What happens if this goes public?" I asked. She smiled faintly, not kindly. "You think truth wins on its own?" "It does not. They will deny everything. They will sue. They will call him a disgruntled employee and you an opportunist. But if we can trace the evidence, prove the shipments, show where the money went, then maybe, just maybe, they will not be able to bury it again." We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the files together. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, the way only someone trained to notice anomalies could move. She pointed out patterns I had missed, numbers repeating in shipment logs, internal memos signed by the same executive who later resigned quietly, unexplained donations to a political action committee. The picture grew darker, sharper. When dusk came, the clinic emptied of patients, and the hall lights flickered as if tired of staying awake. Dr. Marsh printed a few documents and handed them to me. "Take these," she said. "Keep them separate from the drive. If someone comes looking, do not let them take both." As I walked to the door, she added, "Claire, be careful. Men like the ones who built this, when their secrets start to leak, they do not try to fix the damage. They destroy the evidence." Outside, the street lamps were just beginning to glow, halos in the fog. I drove home with the papers on the seat beside me, checking my mirror too often, every headlight behind me feeling like a threat. By the time I pulled into my building's lot, the air had that cold, metallic stillness that comes before a storm. Inside my apartment, the quiet felt heavier than usual. I poured myself a glass of water, but it tasted of nothing. I laid the printed pages on the table and stared at them until the words blurred. Somewhere deep down, I realized I was no longer just reading Michael's story. I was part of it now. Whatever he had uncovered, whatever he had died trying to expose, was now my inheritance. That night, I could not sleep. Each sound outside car doors, footsteps, the elevator felt like a question with no good answer. Around 3 in the morning, a soft thud came from the hallway, maybe a newspaper, maybe something else. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dim light buzzing above the exit sign. Still, when I woke the next morning, there was an envelope slipped under the door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Me, standing outside Dr. Marsh's clinic the day before. The message was clear. Someone already knew. I stared at the photograph for a long time before I let myself breathe. The image was sharp and recent, me standing outside Dr. Marsh's clinic, one hand on the car door, the other clutching my coat against the wind. Whoever took it had been close. Too close. My name was not written anywhere, no threats, no symbols, just the picture, as if to say, "We see you." I did not go to work that day. I spent the morning pacing the apartment, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that someone could have been testing a new camera or walking a dog or waiting for the bus. But deep down, I knew. The same people who had followed Michael had now found me. I burned the photograph in the sink, watched the corners curl, and told myself that fear was a kind of fuel. By late afternoon, I drove to the public library. It was nearly empty, the way libraries are on weekdays, all dust and hum. I used one of the old computers near the window to dig deeper into the company records. Dr. Marsh had been right, names repeated, dates reappeared, shipments sent to addresses that did not exist. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Some of the pharmacy accounts led back to small shell companies with identical directors, each one registered to a single building in downtown Cleveland. I printed everything I could find, slipped it into a folder, and drove home before dark. The streets felt different now, the town smaller, the light dimmer, as if the whole place was holding its breath. That evening, I called Dr. Marsh from a payphone at the old gas station 2 blocks from my apartment. "Someone's watching me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then you are getting close," she replied. "Do not panic. Just keep everything in separate places, backup copies, nothing in your house that can be traced back to him." "I found shell companies," I said. "All linked to one address in Cleveland." There was a pause on the other end, then her voice lowered. "That address belongs to a man named Richard Gavel. He was the head of compliance for Lakeview. He walked away with a retirement bonus instead of a prison sentence. If the money trails lead to him, we can prove they knew what they were doing." I asked, "Why did you stay silent after you left?" She sighed. "Because I was tired of losing. Because the truth is expensive, Claire. It takes everything from you, your career, your safety, your sleep, and it gives you nothing but conscience. I already paid once. I could not afford to pay again." I hung up and sat in the car for a while, the payphone booth fogging with my breath. For the first time, I realized how alone Michael must have felt, fighting something too large to name, surrounded by people who had learned to look away. When I got home, the hallway light outside my door was flickering. A small envelope had been taped to the frame. No writing, no name. Inside was a single key, plain brass with the number 211 scratched into it. I turned it over in my palm, uncertain whether it was a warning or an invitation. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I pulled out Michael's boxes again and started searching through them. In the third box, hidden beneath old expense reports, I found another letter. It was short, written in his uneven late-night handwriting. If you are still reading, it means you did not stop where I told you to. I should have known you wouldn't. The key belongs to the old storage facility near the river, the one we used before the move. There's something there I could not send through the mail. If you are going, do it during the day, and do not tell anyone. The next morning I drove to the river. The air was raw and metallic, the sky a pale shade of winter. The facility sat behind a row of rusted warehouses, its sign missing half its letters. The clerk at the front barely looked up when I gave the number. 211? That's an old one, he said, flipping through a binder. Hasn't been opened in years. He handed me a clipboard to sign. Lights don't work in that section. You'll need a flashlight. The hallway smelled of damp paper and oil. When I found the unit, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely fit the key. The lock resisted at first, then clicked open with a sound that felt like memory. I rolled the door up, and a beam of sunlight spilled across the floor, catching on dust that drifted like ghosts. Inside were 3 crates, sealed with tape so brittle it flaked away at the touch. The first held stacks of documents, shipping manifests, payment authorizations, and handwritten notes. The second contained dozens of small white bottles with faded labels, each marked with the same lot number, 2387, the batch that Michael said had killed people. The third crate held something else, a leather briefcase with a single envelope inside. The envelope was addressed to Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cleveland Division. I opened it and found a draft of a letter Michael had never sent. To whom it may concern, I am submitting evidence of illegal distribution of expired pharmaceuticals by Adler Manufacturing and its partners at Lakeview Medical. Enclosed are original documents and sample products for verification. I am aware this will make me a target. If anything happens to me, I ask that the materials be reviewed by Dr. Evelyn Marsh of Riverton, Ohio, who can confirm their authenticity. The victims deserve truth. They deserve better than silence. Sincerely, Michael Adler. My throat closed. He had tried. He had gathered everything, written the letter, packed the proof, and then stopped. Somewhere between courage and fear. I did not blame him. Courage looks different when you are standing at the edge alone. I heard a sound outside the unit, metal shifting, footsteps echoing down the hall. My heart jumped. I turned off the flashlight, crouched behind the crates, and waited. A door somewhere nearby slammed shut. Then silence. When I finally stepped out, the corridor was empty, but a small piece of paper had been taped to the wall near my door. 3 words written in block letters. Go home, Claire. I locked the unit, left the building, and did not look back until I was in the car. The river ran black beneath the bridge, the current slow but certain. I realized then what Michael had meant when he said, I wanted the consequences to have a place to land. He had left me the truth, but the truth was alive, moving, dangerous. That night, I called Dr. Marsh again. I found the batch, I said quietly. The real vials, they still exist. She drew in a sharp breath. Then we have them. That's the one thing they cannot erase. Keep them hidden, do not bring them home. I thought of Michael's letter to the authorities. Unsent forever. He wanted to go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I said. Then maybe, she replied, that is exactly where we should start. Her words hung in the silence between us, fragile and electric. I knew then that whatever line Michael had crossed, I was already following him. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I could not live with what I now knew. As I ended the call, the lights in my apartment flickered once, then steadied. I stood by the window looking out at the street, the rain beginning again in soft, deliberate drops. Somewhere below, an engine idled for too long before driving away. And I thought maybe the dead do not haunt us to be remembered. Maybe they come back to finish what they could not. The next morning, the sky looked colorless, an in-between shade that was not gray, not blue, just something tired. I tried to go back to normal. I really did. I put on my diner uniform, tied my hair the same way, and drove to work through the thin fog that hovered above the asphalt. But the world no longer accepted my pretending. When I walked through the diner doors, conversations paused for half a heartbeat too long. People looked away quickly, the way they do when they have been told something they should not repeat. Gary pulled me aside after the morning rush. "Claire," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "somebody came by asking about you. Said they were from a credit agency. Didn't look like one." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I told them you've been here 5 years. Show up on time, keep to yourself." "That's all I said." His voice dropped lower. "Be careful, okay?" I nodded, though my stomach was already tightening. I finished my shift, counting the minutes until I could leave. When I stepped outside, my car door handle was scratched, the seat adjusted forward, my glove compartment open. Nothing was taken, but everything was touched. That was the message. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles whitened. At the apartment building, I hesitated before unlocking the door. Everything looked normal, but the air inside carried the faint scent of someone else's cologne. I checked my drawers, my closet, the box under my bed where I had hidden the flash drive and the documents from Dr. Marsh. The drive was gone. The papers remained. Whoever came knew exactly what to take. I called Dr. Marsh immediately. She answered on the second ring. "They broke in," I said, my voice shaking. "They took the drive." "Then they know we are serious," she replied, her voice firm, no trace of panic. "Do you still have the physical evidence? The vials?" "Yes. I kept them in my trunk like you said." "Good. Keep them there for now. We still have copies of the files. I backed up everything last night." Her calm steadied me, but only for a moment. "What if they come for us?" I asked. She sighed. "They already have. The question is what we do now." That night, I stayed awake on the couch, watching headlights drift across the ceiling. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, the soft tick of the clock. I realized then that fear is not a scream but a hum that never stops. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered. A man's voice, quiet and measured. "Claire, you are in possession of stolen property belonging to Adler Manufacturing." I froze. "Who is this?" "That does not matter. You have something that was never yours. Bring it to the parking lot behind the old rail yard tomorrow at 10 a.m. Leave it in the trunk. Walk away. If you do that, this ends." "And if I don't?" I whispered. A pause, then a soft chuckle. "You will." The call ended. I sat there staring at the screen until the light dimmed. Then I called Dr. Marsh again. She answered, sounding half awake. I told her everything. "They gave me a time," I said. "Do not go," she said immediately. "They will not stop there. Once you hand it over, you disappear too. Meet me in the morning instead. Bring everything. I know someone at the newspaper in Cleveland, an investigative reporter named Jonah Weller. He's stubborn enough to listen." The next day, I drove 2 hours north with the vials hidden in a grocery bag beneath the passenger seat. The highway stretched endlessly, pale winter light reflecting off the wet asphalt. I kept checking my rearview mirror. A black sedan followed for miles, sometimes close, sometimes distant. When I exited toward the city, it turned the opposite way. I told myself that meant nothing. The newspaper office was small, tucked between an insurance company and a pawn shop. Inside, everything smelled of ink and stale coffee. Jonah Weller looked exactly like someone who had spent 20 years chasing stories no one wanted to read, sharp-eyed, rumpled, exhausted, but curious. He listened while we talked Dr. Marsh explaining the medical trail, me describing the threats, the break-in, the call. When I placed the vials on his desk, his expression changed from interest to something like dread. He picked one up, squinting at the faded label. "If this is what I think it is, it could bring down 6 people, but it could also get you killed." "Then you believe us?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I do. But proof is a dangerous thing when the wrong people still hold power." He agreed to verify everything quietly, contacting a chemist he trusted, cross-checking batch numbers, reaching out to a source in the Department of Justice. "Give me a week," he said. "If I find something solid, I'll go public. Until then, you both need to vanish." On the drive home, the road felt longer, darker. Every set of headlights in the mirror made my pulse jump. I kept thinking of Michael's letter, the way he said I wanted the consequences to have a place to land. Maybe this was it. Maybe that place was me. When I finally reached Riverton, police cars lined the street near my apartment building. 2 fire engines, flashing lights cutting through the drizzle. I parked across the road, heart pounding. Smoke curled up from the 3rd floor, my window. A neighbor I barely knew stood wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide. "Claire!" she shouted when she saw me. "Your place, something exploded in the kitchen." I ran forward before an officer stopped me. "You can't go in there," he said. "The fire's contained, but it's not safe. Were you the tenant?" "Yes," I said, the word barely leaving my mouth. Was anyone inside?" He shook his head. "No, you're lucky, but it doesn't look accidental." Lucky. That was the word he used. Lucky. I stood there in the wet street, watching the smoke drift into the night, and realized how small my life had become. A diner waitress, a handful of evidence, and a ghost of a man who had loved me enough to ruin me. Dr. Marsh found me an hour later. She had heard about the fire on the scanner. "They are tightening the circle," she said quietly. "You cannot stay here anymore. Jonah will need time, but if he's right, we'll have one shot to expose them, one story that can't be silenced." I looked up at my building, the windows dark and broken, and thought of everything I had lost before marriage, safety, peace, and realized that this was different. This time the loss had purpose. We drove out of town that night, heading north toward a borrowed cabin near Lake Erie. Rain streaked across the windshield, each drop catching the light from passing cars like tiny fleeting stars. Somewhere behind us, Riverton disappeared into the dark. Michael once told me that truth was like water. You could dam it, divert it, poison it, but eventually it finds its way back to the surface. I watched the highway lines blur beneath the headlights and wondered if that was what we were now, a current too small to see, but strong enough to carve through rock. When we reached the cabin, I sat in the stillness and listened to the rain on the roof. For the first time since the phone call, I felt something that almost resembled peace. Then, from outside, headlights swept briefly across the trees before fading. A car engine idled for a moment, then drove away. They had found us again. Morning came late to the lake. The sky was the color of ash, and the water barely moved, as if it too was waiting for something to begin. I had not slept. Neither had Dr. Marsh. We took turns watching the road from the cabin window, the cold air seeping in through the cracks. There was a calm that was not peace, the kind of calm that comes when fear runs out of things to say. At 8, her phone rang. Unknown number. We stared at each other until the second ring, then she answered. No sound came through, only a faint hum. She ended the call, checked the screen, and frowned. "Blocked," she said. Then softer. "They already know we're here." We packed our things, what little we had, and debated whether to leave. Before we could decide, a knock came at the door. 3 slow knocks. I froze. She reached for the heavy flashlight near the counter. "Stay back," she whispered. A man's voice came through the wood, steady but tired. "I'm not here to hurt you, Claire." My breath caught. The voice was familiar. Not Michael's, it couldn't be, but something about it held the same rhythm, the same careful patience. I stepped closer. "Who are you?" "Name's Peter Hale," he said. "I worked with your husband. Logistics division. I was his friend." Dr. Marsh exchanged a look with me, then opened the door halfway. The man standing outside was in his late 40s, lean, hollow-eyed, wearing a coat that had seen too many winters. His hands were visible, empty. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know," he replied, "but you need to hear what I have." We let him in. He moved carefully, glancing at the corners of the room before sitting down. "I was there the night Michael died," he said quietly. "Not at the exact moment, but close enough. I felt the world tilt. He had a heart attack. That's what they told me." Peter shook his head. "That's what they wanted you to believe. Michael didn't die naturally. He was going to meet a contact at a motel outside Columbus, a man from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He never made it. His car was found crashed near the river, but the airbags hadn't deployed, and there was no sign of impact. The police called it mechanical failure. The engine was fine." I felt my chest tighten. "You're saying they killed him?" "I'm saying it wasn't an accident," he said. "He was scared, but he wasn't reckless. The night before, he told me he had finally finished gathering proof. He said if anything happened, the files would reach you." His gaze softened. "He trusted you more than anyone." Dr. Marsh leaned forward. "Why come now?" Because I can't live with it anymore, he said. They're watching me too, but I've been keeping something, a copy of his last correspondence. He pulled out a folded envelope and placed it on the table. Inside was a printed email thread between Michael and someone identified only as RG. The subject line read, "Final shipment documentation. Urgent." The messages were brief, professional, but there was something wrong in their politeness. "Michael, if you've completed the transfer, the board will consider your request satisfied. We all want this to end quietly. Let's not make mistakes that can't be corrected." "RG," I murmured. "Richard Gable." Peter nodded. Gable was the one running the show. But here's the thing, Michael wasn't sending him confirmation. He was baiting him. The transfer he mentioned wasn't money. It was the evidence. He had already made copies and sent them somewhere safe. The rest was to draw Gable out. "Where?" I asked. "Where did he send it?" "That's the problem," Peter said. "He never told me. Only that it would reach someone who understood what to do with it. Someone who owed him a favor. Someone who owes him." Dr. Marsh repeated slowly, her brow furrowed. "There was one person. The journalist he once helped during the contamination scare at the plant, Jonah Weller." I looked at her. "He's the reporter we gave the files to." Peter's eyes widened. "Then you need to find him now. Because if Gable knows those files exist, Jonah is the next target." We left the cabin before noon, heading back toward Cleveland. The highway stretched endless and pale, the trees bending under the wind. Halfway there, Dr. Marsh's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Too late, should have stayed quiet." Attached was a photograph of Jonah's office windows shattered, smoke rising. She swore softly under her breath, pressing the phone to her forehead. "God, no." When we arrived, the street was cordoned off by police tape. Fire trucks, black cars, flashing lights, reporters milling nearby, all kept at a distance. The newspaper building was a shell, its interior gutted by fire. I caught a glimpse of a stretcher being wheeled out covered. An officer stopped us from approaching. "Ma'am, this is an active scene." I said nothing. I couldn't. I just stood there staring at the smoke curling up into the overcast sky, realizing that everything Michael had built to reveal the truth was being erased, piece by piece. Dr. Marsh placed a hand on my shoulder. "We can't fall apart now," she said softly. "If Jonah had time, he might have transferred something. Reporters keep backups." Peter nodded grimly. "He used an encrypted server for his investigations. I can try to find it, but we'll need his credentials. If we can get in, maybe the files survived." We found Jonah's apartment that evening. It had already been searched, drawers pulled open, papers scattered. But behind a loose panel in the bedroom closet, we found a small external hard drive wrapped in a torn envelope. No label, no clue, just wait. "We need a safe place to look at it," Peter said. We drove to an old motel off the highway, the kind of place no one noticed. Inside, the lights flickered and the carpet smelled of damp wool. Dr. Marsh set up her laptop and Peter connected the drive. It opened to a single folder named Adler Case, Full Archive. My hands trembled as we clicked through. There it was, everything. Scans, contracts, photographs of expired medicine with falsified labels, bank records linking Adler Manufacturing to Lakeview, and payments authorized by Richard Gable. Proof, solid and undeniable. I sank into the chair, tears burning the corners of my eyes. "Michael did it," I whispered. "He actually did it." Dr. Marsh leaned closer to the screen, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "This is enough to indict half the board." Peter nodded, his face pale. "If we can get it to the right hands before they find us." Before he could finish, the lights in the room flickered again, then died. A car engine roared outside. Headlights swept across the thin curtains, bright and sudden. Dr. Marsh whispered, "They found us." Peter stood, moving toward the window, but before he reached it, a bullet shattered the glass. He fell backward, the sound sharp and final. I screamed, dropping to the floor, the laptop clattering beside me. "Claire!" Marsh pulled me behind the bed. Another shot tore through the doorframe. The air filled with dust and adrenaline. "Take the drive," she hissed. "Run out the back, I'm not leaving you, you have to. You're the only one they don't expect to fight." I grabbed the drive, my heart hammering in my ears. We crawled toward the back exit, the noise of footsteps approaching. Marsh pushed me toward the door. "Go," she said. "Finish what he started." I run. The cold hit me like a slap. The ground was wet, the night sharp with gunfire and wind. I didn't look back until I reached the trees. When I did, the motel was burning. Flames licked the sky, red and furious. Somewhere inside that fire, two people who had believed in truth were disappearing. And all I had left was a single drive clutched in my shaking hand, the rain starting to fall again. I did not know where I would go next. I only knew one thing. Michael's war was now mine, and I wasn't ready to lose. The fire at the motel burned through most of the night, and by dawn it was nothing but a blackened outline against the pale sky. The news called it an accident caused by faulty wiring. I watched the broadcast from a diner 2 towns away, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. They never mentioned names, just 2 bodies found in the wreckage. No witnesses, no suspects. No truth. I knew better. One of them was Dr. Evelyn Marsh. The other was Peter Hale. 2 people who had risked everything to bring light to a story the world refused to see. I sat there staring at the television until the waitress asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. It was the last lie I told that day. Outside, the wind had the edge of winter. The streets looked clean, quiet, harmless. I walked without purpose, the flash drive hidden in my jacket pocket, my mind replaying every sound from the night before the gunfire, the glass shattering, Peter's final breath, the explosion that swallowed their names. Every step felt heavier than the one before. By the time I reached the bus station, I was shaking. Not from fear anymore, but from the kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones. I bought a one-way ticket to nowhere. In particular, just the next town over, and waited. I kept expecting someone to appear behind me, a hand on my shoulder, a voice telling me it was over. But no one came. The world kept moving, as if nothing had happened. That night, I checked into a roadside motel under a false name. The room smelled of bleach and loneliness. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the flash drive in my palm. It was warm from my skin, small enough to lose, powerful enough to end lives. I plugged it into my laptop and watched the files load again. Photographs, memos, signatures, proof. I thought of Jonah's burned office, the ruined archives, the fire in Riverton that had taken my apartment. Every piece of evidence was disappearing, except this one. I scrolled through Michael's old folders until I found a video I hadn't opened before. The file name was Claire, If You Survive. My breath caught. I clicked play. Michael sat in a dim room I didn't recognize. His face looked thinner, his voice rougher than before. "If you're watching this," he said, "then it's gone further than I ever wanted. I didn't want you in this. You need to listen carefully." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes tired but steady. Richard Gable isn't just a businessman. He's connected to people who make sure nothing ever reaches court. He controls politicians, lawyers, even a few officers in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If the evidence gets out, he'll burn everything to keep it buried. That's why you can't go through official channels. He hesitated, his expression softening. "There's one person who might help you. His name is Marcus Lang. He used to be an agent. He investigated corporate fraud until they forced him out. He's in Chicago now, working as a private consultant. If you can find him, give him the drive. He'll know what to do." Michael looked down, rubbed his hands together, then added quietly, "I know what you're thinking, that I'm sorry isn't enough. You're right. But everything I've done was for you, even when it broke you. If you ever find peace in this, let it be yours, not mine." The video ended. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, my reflection caught in it like a ghost. Somewhere, far beyond the walls, a train passed, its horn long and low, fading into the distance. For the first time since Michael's death, I cried. Not out of grief, not out of fear, but because I understood him now. He hadn't left to save himself. He had left because he couldn't carry both the truth and me at the same time. When I woke the next morning, I felt hollow but clear. I knew what I had to do. Chicago, Marcus Lang, the last name on the list. The drive there was long and gray. Snow fell in thin, uncertain flurries that melted before touching the ground. I stopped only for gas, keeping my head down, watching every car that followed too closely. Near sunset, I crossed into the city. The skyline rose ahead, sharp against the fading light. I had been here once, years ago, with Michael. We'd stood on the Riverwalk, laughing about nothing, believing the world was simpler than it really was. Lang's office was in an old brick building by the river. No sign, no markings, just a small plaque with his name. The door opened before I could knock twice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with gray hair and a voice that carried the roughness of cigarettes and time. "You must be Claire," he said. "He told me you might come." I froze. "Michael?" Lang nodded. "He called me before he disappeared. Said if anything happened, you'd find me." He gestured for me to come inside. "You've been through hell. Sit down." The office was dim, walls lined with file boxes and coffee cups. I handed him the flash drive. "Everything's on there. Documents, photographs, financials. Enough to destroy Adler Manufacturing and Lakeview." He plugged it in, scanning the folders quickly. "I've seen some of this before," he said. "He sent me fragments years ago, but I couldn't touch them without risking exposure. Now, with what you have, we can prove collusion, criminal negligence, and bribery." I nodded, the exhaustion settling in. "Then we go to the authorities?" Lang shook his head. "Not yet. If we hand this to the wrong person, it disappears. We need to release it publicly, leak it to independent journalists, upload copies to secure servers, make it impossible to erase." He paused, studying me. "You're ready for that?" I thought about the bodies, the fires, the silence that had followed each death. "I don't have a choice," I said. He smiled faintly. "Good answer." We spent the next hours transferring files, encrypting copies, sending fragments to journalists and advocacy groups. Each click felt like a heartbeat, a small act of defiance against the machine that had swallowed Michael whole. By the time the sun rose, I was shaking from exhaustion. Lang poured me coffee and said, "Once this goes live, you'll need to disappear again. They won't stop looking." "I've already lost everything," I said. "There's nothing left to take." He studied me for a long moment. "That's when you're most dangerous." The first article appeared online 3 days later. Headline: "Pharmaceutical giant accused of distributing expired medication, linked to multiple deaths." The story spread fast: news outlets, networks, public outrage. The names surfaced, the evidence held. Richard Gable's photograph appeared on every screen. But victory didn't feel like victory. It felt quiet, tired, necessary. I watched the coverage from a bus station outside the city, the same coffee cooling in my hands. Michael's voice echoed in my mind. "If you ever find peace in this, let it be yours, not mine." For a long time, I didn't move. The bus to nowhere idled outside, engine humming softly in the winter air. The driver called out for passengers, but I stayed seated. I wanted to believe it was over, that the truth would finally matter. But deep down I knew stories like this never really ended. They just stopped making noise. Outside, snow began to fall again slow, deliberate flakes settling on the empty street. I stepped out into it, the cold sharp against my skin, and whispered into the wind, "It's done, Michael." But the wind didn't answer. Only the sound of the bus door closing behind me and the long road ahead, waiting to see what kind of peace was left to find. The days that followed were quiet, and that quiet hurt more than fear ever had. I rented a small room above a laundromat on the south side of the city, where the machines ran all night and the walls smelled faintly of detergent and steam. From my window, I could see the river moving slow and dark under the bridges, the streetlights trembling in its reflection. I thought I would feel relief after the story broke. Instead, I felt hollow, like something inside me had burned down with the last of the fires. Every channel was talking about the scandal now. Adler Manufacturing, Lakeview Medical, the falsified records, the quiet deaths that had filled so many homes. Politicians called for reform. Lawyers called for restraint. People cried on television, holding pictures of the ones they had lost. The company denied everything at first, then promised cooperation, then said nothing. And through it all, I sat in my room, watching the city move on without me. I stopped eating. I stopped answering the phone. Each time I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, someone thinner, older, and quieter than before. Guilt is strange that way. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in like fog, soft and unrelenting, until you start believing it's the weather you deserve. One night, a knock came at the door. For a moment, I froze, expecting the sound of boots, of danger. But when I opened it, a woman stood there holding a newspaper. She looked tired, her coat still wet from the rain. "You're Claire Whitaker, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. She handed me the paper. On the front page was a photograph of a young boy with dark eyes and a shy smile. Beneath it, Joshua Kent, age 7, one of the victims tied to Adler Manufacturing's mislabeled medication. "That was my son," the woman said softly. "He died 2 years ago. They told me it was a reaction, that nothing could have been done. I believed them. Until your story." Her voice trembled. "I just wanted to say thank you for not staying quiet." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it wasn't bravery, that I hadn't done it for justice, not really. I'd done it for love, for guilt, for the hope that something good could still grow out of something ruined. But the words caught in my throat. I simply nodded and watched her walk away into the rain. After she left, I sat by the window for hours. The street below was washed in yellow light, each puddle catching the glow like liquid glass. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang a slow, lonely sound that carried through the mist. I hadn't prayed in years, but that night I found myself whispering words I barely remembered, not asking for forgiveness, just for understanding. By morning, the first arrests had begun. The news anchors spoke in careful tones about criminal investigations, whistleblower protections, and the collapse of a pharmaceutical empire. They showed clips of Richard Gable being led out of his mansion, his face hidden behind a coat. The reporters called it justice, but justice is never clean. It doesn't restore what's gone. It just stops the bleeding long enough for the scars to form. Later that day, I visited the old cathedral downtown, the one Michael and I had walked past once on a trip years ago, joking that we'd get married there if life ever went our way. Inside, the air smelled of wax and stone. The stained glass glowed like trapped fire. I sat in the back pew and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I spoke to him, not out loud, but in the quiet language of memory. "You were right, Michael. The truth came out, but it didn't fix anything. It just showed how broken we already were." Tears came quietly. They didn't feel like surrender. They felt like confession. I thought of Dr. Marsh and Peter Hale, of Jonah, of everyone who had carried a piece of the truth until it became too heavy to hold. I thought of that boy in the newspaper. I thought of Michael, and the way he used to believe that good people could still matter. When I left the church, rain was falling again, fine and steady. It slid down the steps, down my coat, down everything, as if the world was trying to wash itself clean. In the reflection of a puddle, I saw my face tired, pale, streaked with water, and for the first time I didn't look away. That night, I went back to the river. The city lights shimmered across the surface, breaking apart in ripples. I took the flash drive from my pocket, the same one that had started it all. It was useless now. The data had already spread across servers and newsrooms. Still, I couldn't keep it. I whispered, "Thank you," and dropped it into the water. It sank without a sound. The rain kept falling, and I stood there until I couldn't tell where the river ended and the tears began. Somewhere behind me, sirens wailed softly, distant, fading. The story was no longer mine. It belonged to everyone who had lost something and to everyone still trying to believe in something better. When I finally walked away, dawn was beginning to color the horizon, a thin, uncertain light that felt like forgiveness. Not the kind that erases what came before, but the kind that lets you keep living with it. Spring came late that year. The last of the snow clung to the curbs like it didn't know when to leave, and the wind still carried the taste of winter. I had moved again farther north this time, to a small town by the edge of Lake Michigan where no one knew my name and no one cared to ask. The kind of place where the most important headline was about the fishing season. It felt almost safe. The world had already moved on from the scandal. New stories filled the screens. New faces replaced the old ones. A few executives were indicted, a few politicians resigned, and people argued on talk shows about responsibility and reform. For a week, my name appeared in articles, sometimes as the whistleblower's widow, sometimes just a woman connected to the case. Then it disappeared, swallowed by the next outrage. I was grateful. I rented a small cottage near the water, a place with uneven floors and windows that stuck when it rained. Most days I walked along the shore with my hands in my pockets, collecting pebbles or watching the gulls. The lake had a way of erasing sound, leaving only the slow pulse of the waves. I learned to breathe again in that silence. There were mornings when I woke before dawn, the air still cold, the horizon a thin line of silver. I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and think about Michael not as a ghost anymore, not as a wound, but as something that had finally come to rest. I would think about the people who were gone, about the ones who survived, and about the strange kind of peace that comes when you realize the world isn't fair, but you've learned to live anyway. Sometimes I still saw his handwriting in my dreams, the sharp slant of his letters, the way his words always leaned forward, as if trying to outrun time. I would wake up and half expect to find a note on the table, but the only sound was the wind pressing softly against the windows and the quiet creak of the house settling. One afternoon I found myself in the town library, a small building that smelled of paper and rain. On the bulletin board by the entrance, someone had pinned a clipping from a national newspaper. Adler Manufacturing pleads guilty to federal charges settlement fund established for victims' families. Beneath it, a handwritten note, "Justice at last." I stood there for a long time, tracing the words with my eyes. Justice. It didn't feel like the right word. The children were still gone. The lives were still broken. But maybe justice wasn't a finish line. Maybe it was the quiet decision to keep telling the truth even when no one listens. Later that evening, I walked to the pier. The lake was still, a perfect mirror of the sky. I sat at the edge, shoes off, feet dangling above the cold water. In the distance, a small boat drifted by, its engine humming faintly. Everything felt distant yet alive, like the world was breathing again, and this time I was breathing with it. I thought about forgiveness then. Not the kind that demands words or closure, but the kind that grows slowly, like light returning after a long night. Forgiveness for Michael, for myself, even for the people who would never understand what they had done. It wasn't about letting them go. It was about letting go of what they had made me become. The sun dipped lower, painting the water in gold. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not triumph, just the quiet recognition that I had survived. And survival, I realized, is its own kind of grace. When I stood to leave, a breeze lifted across the lake, soft and cold. It carried with it the faint scent of rain, and somewhere in that scent was the memory of a man who once believed truth could fix the world. I whispered his name, and it didn't hurt anymore. As I walked back to the cottage, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow and steady. The kind of rain that doesn't ask for shelter. The kind that cleans without erasing. Inside, I lit a small candle on the table, not as an offering, not as mourning, but as a reminder that light doesn't have to be loud to be real. Outside, the lake kept breathing. The storm rolled gently across the horizon, and for the first time since everything began, I closed my eyes and slept without dreaming. By the time summer came, the lake had turned the color of pewter. Even the mornings felt heavier, as if the air itself remembered what it had seen. I thought I was done with the story. With Michael, with the company, with everything, but the truth has a way of finding the people who owe it something. It started with a letter. No return address, postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. They're reopening the case. M.L. At first, I didn't understand who it was from, until I remembered Marcus Lang, the former agent who had helped release the files. I read the letter twice before the meaning settled. Someone had decided to fight back. The next day, my phone rang. I hadn't used it in weeks. A familiar voice spoke quietly. "Claire, it's Marcus. I know you wanted to stay out, but you deserve to know Richard Gable is being moved to testify before a federal grand jury. He's agreed to cooperate." I felt the words hit me like a wave. Cooperate? After everything he's done? He's naming people higher than him, Marcus said. But there's a problem. 2 witnesses are already dead. They're calling it suicide. I don't buy it. And I think he's afraid someone will get to him before he can talk. I didn't want to care anymore, but the thought of Gable escaping the truth, the thought of Michael dying for nothing pulled me back. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Just to listen," Marcus said. "He asked to speak to you." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. "To me? He says he owes you an explanation. 2 days later, I was sitting in the corner of a gray government room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a paper cup of bad coffee cooling in my hand. Across from me sat Richard Gable. His once perfect hair was thinning now, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Time had stripped him of his confidence, but not his composure. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You look like him," he said quietly. "Don't," I warned. "You don't get to talk about him." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Michael was persistent. I respected that. I didn't want him dead. "Then who did?" He sighed, leaning back. "You still don't understand how big this was. Adler Manufacturing was a symptom, not the disease. The orders came from investors, people with power, with connections that reached far past this country. When Michael found out, he became a liability. I tried to warn him. I told him to stop digging. He looked down at his cuffed hands. He didn't listen. Because he believed the truth mattered, I said. Something you'll never understand." Gable smiled faintly, a tired, almost pitying smile. "You think the truth wins? It doesn't. It just changes hands." I wanted to stand, to walk out, but something in his voice held me. It wasn't confession, it was warning. "They'll bury this again," he said. "When I testify, they'll make sure I don't leave the courthouse alive. And when I'm gone, someone new will take my place. That's how it works." "Then why tell me?" I asked. "Because he'd want you to know it wasn't for nothing," Gable said softly. "The story you released, people saw it. People talked. That's the only thing they can't kill. Noise." He paused. "You made noise." A guard stepped forward, signaling the time was up. As they led him away, Gable turned once more. "If you really want to finish what he started, find the others, follow the money. It doesn't end with me." After he was gone, I sat there alone, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder than ever. For the first time, I felt no fear, just exhaustion, and the strange calm that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Later that night, I met Marcus at a diner near the courthouse. He slid a folder across the table. "He was right," he said. "There's another layer. Offshore accounts, anonymous boards, shell companies in 3 countries. He wasn't exaggerating." I opened the folder. Inside were names, dozens of them. Politicians, investors, regulators. Each one connected by the same thin thread of profit and silence. It was a map of rot. Marcus looked at me carefully. "If we push this, it won't just be about Adler anymore. It'll go higher, and you'll be their first target again." I thought of the rain on the lake, the woman who had lost her son, the faces of everyone who had died trying to make this right. "Then let them come," I said. "I'm done being quiet." The next morning, we walked into the press conference together. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. Marcus laid the documents on the podium like offerings. I stood beside him, trembling, but steady. He began to speak measured, calm, precise. He talked about corruption, collusion, murder disguised as business. He named names. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward. Phones rang. The noise was overwhelming. Through it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the simple, terrifying rush of being alive. Hours later, after it was done, I stepped outside into the light. The city was loud with sirens and wind. Somewhere behind me, people were shouting, running, celebrating, or condemning. It was hard to tell which. But above it all, I heard the one sound that mattered, the faint rhythm of rain beginning to fall. I tilted my face to the sky. It wasn't mercy I felt, and it wasn't victory. It was release. Michael once told me the truth doesn't set you free, it just shows you what your cage looks like. Maybe he was right. But standing there, with the storm breaking open above the city, I realized something else. Sometimes, seeing the bars is enough to make you push. The rain came harder, washing the streets clean, blurring the lights until everything shimmered like the surface of a dream. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw him there in the crowd, his face turned toward the sky, smiling the way he used to when he believed the world could still be saved. Then the vision faded, and only the rain remained. The storm passed, but the noise didn't. For weeks, the city lived inside the echo of what had happened. The trial, the testimonies, the sudden resignations that came one after another. Names that once ruled boardrooms now belonged to evening news headlines. People argued about guilt and responsibility until the words lost meaning. Some called it justice, some called it chaos. I called it the end of silence. The morning after the press conference, I woke to find the world already dissecting the story. Newspapers used photographs of me I didn't know existed. Television shows debated whether I was brave or reckless. Online, strangers turned my life into a parable, the waitress who brought down an empire. They used that phrase so often that it began to sound like it belonged to someone else. Marcus told me to stay hidden, at least until the first indictments were official. He found me a safe house near the outskirts of the city, a small apartment with bare walls and a view of the river. I stayed there through the trial, watching the world from behind glass. Each night, the news played out like a strange, distorted reflection of my life. Lawyers reading statements, senators making promises, survivors speaking the names of the people they had lost. When Richard Gable finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He looked older, smaller, his voice hoarse but steady as he read his statement. He spoke of corporate negligence, of systemic failure, of deep regret. Not once did he say murder. Not once did he say Michael Adler. Still, the judge called it enough. Gable was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Others followed: executives, regulators, financiers. The verdicts rolled out one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. For the first time, people called the victims by name on live television. When the trial ended, Marcus met me by the river. He looked tired, but lighter somehow. "It's over," he said. "No," I replied. "It's finished." "That's not the same thing." He smiled, understanding. "You could testify before Congress if you wanted. They're forming a reform committee." "I've given enough words," I said quietly. We stood there watching the current carry fragments of sunlight. The river was swollen from the recent rain, moving fast and full, reflecting a sky that finally seemed clear. That evening, I walked through the streets of downtown Chicago. People were already moving on the way cities always do. Storefronts glowed, couples laughed outside restaurants, buses sighed against curbs. Life was happening again, indifferent but persistent. It was strange and beautiful in its ordinary way. I found a small bookstore tucked between two office towers. Inside, the air smelled of paper and quiet. I wandered the aisles until I found the philosophy section, though I wasn't looking for anything specific. On one shelf sat a copy of Letters to a Young Poet. I opened it randomly. The line I saw read, "Perhaps everything terrible is in its deepest being, something helpless that wants help from us." I bought the book and walked out into the evening. The streetlights had just come on. The city glimmered like a field of scattered stars. In the weeks that followed, people began reaching out: families of victims, journalists, strangers who had seen my name in the papers. They sent letters, sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing but a single line: "Thank you for not giving up." I didn't know how to answer. Gratitude always felt heavier than anger. One afternoon I visited Dr. Marsh's old clinic. It had reopened under a new name, with a small plaque out front dedicating it to her memory. Inside, the walls were freshly painted, but her desk was still there. A nurse told me they had framed her medical license and hung it in the hallway. I stood in front of it for a long time, tracing her name with my eyes. "You were right," I whispered. "The truth costs everything, but it's worth something too." I left a single white lily on the counter before walking back into the light. Months passed, seasons changed. I stayed near the lake, teaching part-time at a community college, helping with ethics seminars, mentoring young women who wanted to become journalists. Some days I still woke up startled, expecting to hear Michael's voice or the ringing of a phone in the night. But the past had softened its grip. It was no longer a wound, just a scar I carried quietly. On the anniversary of his death, I drove back to Riverton. The diner was still there, the same chipped counter, the same smell of coffee and grease. Gary was older now, but he recognized me immediately. "You vanished," he said with a smile, "but I guess you had your reasons." We talked for a while. Then I walked to the edge of town, to the small cemetery overlooking the river. Michael's grave was simple: his name, his dates, and beneath them, the words "He told the truth." Someone had left a small bouquet of wildflowers, fresh. I knelt beside the stone and brushed away a few fallen leaves. I did it. I said softly. It's over. The wind moved through the trees, gentle, almost kind. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. I closed my eyes, listening. The sound wasn't sorrowful anymore. It was steady, human, alive. When I stood, the sun had begun to set. The light broke through the clouds, scattering across the river like fire. For the first time in a long time, I let myself smile not because I was happy, but because I was free. As I walked back toward the car, I thought about all the people who had carried the truth through the dark so it could reach the light. Dr. Marsh, Peter Hale, Jonah Weller, Marcus Lang, and Michael. Especially Michael. He used to say that redemption isn't about erasing your sins, it's about facing them long enough to change what comes next. Maybe that was what we had done. Maybe that was enough. The sky deepened to gold, then to blue. The last light shimmered across the water like a promise. And somewhere between the sound of the river and the quiet hum of evening, I felt it, that faint, steady rhythm that meant life goes on. Autumn returned quietly, the way forgiveness sometimes does not with a grand arrival, but with the gentle sound of leaves moving in the wind. The town had changed, and so had I. Riverton felt smaller now, softer around the edges, like a photograph that had finally stopped fading. The steel mill was gone, its ruins cleared away to make room for a park. Children played where the smoke once rose. It was the first time I'd seen joy here in years. I moved back that month, not because I wanted to reclaim the past, but because it was the only place that still felt honest. The diner had a new sign, a new owner, and younger hands behind the counter, but the smell of coffee was the same. Gary had retired. The waitress told me he'd moved to Florida. I smiled and said, "Good for him." Sometimes, I walked to the river at dusk, the same way Michael and I once did. The air carried that familiar chill, the kind that made you aware of your own breath. On those evenings, I brought no flowers, no prayers, just quiet. The truth had already been spoken. The dead did not need my words anymore. I often thought about what all of it had cost. The truth, the fight, the years that slipped away like water through my hands. There were nights when I still woke up startled, certain I had heard footsteps outside the door. But when I looked, it was only the wind, reminding me that not all echoes are threats, some are simply memories refusing to leave. I started volunteering at the clinic that now bore Dr. Marsh's name. Most of the patients were tired factory workers, single parents, people who could no longer afford to believe the system would care for them. Sometimes I told them small pieces of my story, not the danger, not the death, just the lesson. That silence is a form of surrender, and truth, no matter how fragile, is still worth carrying. One afternoon, a young nurse asked me, "Do you ever wish it had ended differently?" I thought about that for a while. About the love I had lost, the lives gone, the scars that would never fade. Then I said, no, because if it had, I might never have learned how strong forgiveness really is. That night, the first snow of the season fell quiet, deliberate, covering everything in the same pale mercy. I stood by the window of my small apartment and watched the world turn white. Somewhere, beneath that blanket of silence, was the grave of a man who once believed truth could make the world better. Somewhere, inside that same silence, was the woman who finally proved he was right. I wrote a letter that night, not to anyone living, not to the newspapers, just to him. Michael, the world remembers you now, though not the way you feared. They speak your name in classrooms, in hearings, in quiet conversations about courage. You were not perfect, neither was I. But between us, somehow, the truth survived. I forgive you. I hope, wherever you are, you've forgiven me too. I folded the letter, set it beside a candle, and watched the flame bend slightly toward it as if the light wanted to read. When I stepped outside, the snow was still falling, soft and endless. The river below was half frozen, moving slow but steady beneath the ice. I walked to the bridge and leaned against the railing, feeling the cold bite into my palms. The town lights shimmered through the mist, and for a moment, I could almost believe they were stars. Maybe that's what redemption really is, not the absence of darkness, but the decision to keep walking even when you can't see the road ahead. The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the park, and I found myself smiling. It wasn't joy exactly, but something deeper, acceptance, maybe even grace. I turned to leave, my footprints already disappearing in the snow. Behind me, the river whispered against the ice, the same quiet rhythm it had kept since the beginning. And as I walked home, I whispered a single line, the one truth that had carried me through it all. The light always returns to those who refuse to stop walking.